Thank you, Rajul, and thank you all for coming. And the purpose of my presentation is to make you see how the global level type of analysis and results that Keith has presented can be used, and we use, to analyze country-level realities and country-level policies that decision makers might be considering in order to achieve particular goals. And the example that I'm going to use is low-emission development strategies. This is because some of the results that I'm going to show you come from a project that financed by USAID and supported by CCAFs that concentrated on low-emission development strategies, although we think that the suite of models and framework we put together actually has a much larger scope of applications. The whole motivation, what motivated us to actually connect with the global level of analysis, is this idea that climate change forces us to really push forward the planning horizon. We often encounter 5-year plans or decision making that is based on election cycles, but we're really facing a completely different horizon in terms of decision making, at least 20, 30 years. And this presents challenges for devising these policies, but also for us, analysts that are trying to sort of make projections about a very uncertain future. And because of this long-term planning, the policies will have to be economically and politically sustainable. And I want to put an emphasis on political sustainability, because this is something that sometimes we economists tend to forget. We only focus on the economic sustainability and the economic viability of policies. But you have to have all sorts of stakeholders and focus groups and really the people who implement and will live with the consequences of some policies. You have to count on their support in order for these policies to be stable, to continue, and to be present in time. And therefore, because of this political and economic sustainability, countries have to take into consideration what happens to the global landscape, what happens to prices in the long run, what happens to the demands for food production in the long run. In other words, the risk of devising policies that will crumble under budgetary pressure, or will crumble because there is not enough political support in the long run, is really high. This is where we are up against. And this is what we're trying to solve here. And the way that I see it, the way that I've been thinking about this is this, there are these global forces for change driven by GDP growth, technological growth, climate change. You can almost think them as an exogenous force, almost exogenous for some countries. And then there are all the plans that countries might be devised in order to develop. And what we're after is this space of feasible options, of feasible opportunities that account for, yes, your desires and your preferences in terms of a country, but also what happens to the rest of the world. And not everything is viable. And so what approach have we taken? And why is the work, the global work, the type of work that Keith and Mark's team becomes so important? Because we have tried to take these models that have very large sort of macro approach to these changes and evaluated these changes, and they do this at a scale, at a resolution that is okay to answer certain questions, but when you focus on countries, and particularly when you want to understand what happens to emissions and deforestation and changes in carbon stock, that resolution is too coarse. So we connected that type of modeling with more spatially disaggregated type of modeling. And that provides this insight on more localized phenomena. And in particular, we have connected the impact model, which essentially provides us this pressure for change for prices, pressure for change for output in terms of agricultural products, and pressure for change in cropland that has to go into production to satisfy demand. we have connected that, and we use spatially explicit models of land use choices in order to determine where that change will most likely occur in a particular country. And then we connect that to crop models that can provide us very sophisticated analysis in terms of potential yield changes, greenhouse gases changes, and changes in soil organic carbon. Now imagine also that all this happens in landscape that might have forests, might have degraded land. So we're really interested in what happens to carbon stock of all these land uses, not just in emissions from agriculture. And so the output of all this is this sort of spatially explicit country-level results that are consistent, that we think must be consistent with these forces that come with from the global market, these exogenous forces that come from the global landscape. So what is the objective? In our particular case, the objective was to identify viable economic development pathways consistent with low carbon development objectives. So this is what really we're after. And in the end, what we developed is what we think it's a useful decision support tool that provides this ex-ante analysis of policy reforms that can span a wide variety of options, from infrastructure investments to land reform. And in particular, we try to evaluate, yes, what happens to carbon stock and emissions, so on, but also what is their economic feasibility, what happens, what it means in terms of the economy. And the other thing, as I said, we wanted to pay particular attention, and this comes from results from previous studies. We wanted to pay particular attention to all land uses, not just to focus on crop production or agricultural production, but really to understand what happens at the interface between crop production and agriculture and say, forests or marginal lands. So we developed country-specific analysis. And this country-specific analysis can have sort of broad targets. Like in here, I have some examples from Vietnam and Colombia. This is where we have done some of this work, in which, every country has either already official documents with targets, and this is the case of Vietnam, in which their official, the 2020 plan, which is a 20% increase in productivity, a 20% reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions by 2020, or the Green Growth Plan. These are official documents for the government of Vietnam, in which they say, well, we want to achieve those plans by increasing forested areas. And at the same time, we want to keep constant the amount of land that is allocated to rice production. And we have other countries like Colombia that instead is in the process of devising these policies. And so they're really in the planning stage. And so they have policies that look at potential halt or reduction of deforestation in the Amazon, or reduction of land allocated to pasture. So these are more broad type of policy targets, but we also can target things like, and this is the case of Vietnam in particular, where the potential gains in reduction of emissions, and the interesting question might be in the adoption of particular management practice, agricultural management practices, like alternate wet and dry, or replace urea as a fertilizer, and so on. And there is a big difference in these two countries, because actually from our analysis, what you see that these two countries are on two completely different trajectories. And this is what makes sort of this type of comparison among countries so interesting. Vietnam is a country that, for lots of reasons, is already on a wonderful trajectory of reducing emissions. This is because they have paid a lot of attention to reducing deforestation. While instead, Colombia is a country that has a very active sort of deforestation due to expansion of pasture and cattle raising. So there are different realities, but we have put together, I think, a method that that is flexible enough to analyze different situations. And so let me give you a taste of what we get out of this, okay? And so this is some of the results for Colombia. Colombia was particularly interested in analyzing. There were three major policy that were considered. One is intervene radically on the expansion of pasture land. The other one is to halt deforestation in the Amazon. And a third one, because there is a very active producer organization, oil palm producer organization, they're really interested in seeing what are the potential for increasing oil palm production. So we look at these options, and through this series of tools, we're able to essentially rank them to provide some understanding of what are the implications of adopting these policies. So what you have here, if you can make up the numbers, on the vertical axis, you have the effect on agricultural revenues. And so on the sort of towards the north and the vertical axis, you have increases or gains in revenues, and while instead, if you go south, you have basically losses. And on the horizontal axis, instead, you have reduction in emissions on your left and increase in emissions. So on the left, essentially, is your target, what you would like to observe. And so what you have on the upper left quadrant are the so-called win-win solutions. And in fact, what you see here is that this idea of reducing pasture appears to be a win-win policies in which you have an increase in agricultural revenues, while you also have a reduction in emissions that mostly come from avoided deforestation. If you instead focus only on a reduction of deforestation in the Amazon, you have typical trade-offs. And so those are the blue dots you see there. There's a trade-off between loss in agricultural land, in what would have become agricultural land and productive land, but at the same time there is a gain in carbon stock. And when we account for what it means in terms of price per carbon, actually it's not a bad price of carbon at all. It's between $2 and $3 per ton of CO2 equivalent, but still there is a trade-off. More interestingly, and this is where a lot of the attention in the country has focused, is these results for the oil palm industry. In which, for lots of reasons, and we can have a longer discussion, and we have had longer discussions in Colombia, it seems to be that you have to be really careful on how you plan for oil palm expansion. Our results don't say that it's impossible, it's just that the targets that the oil palm industry is putting forward, they seem to be not advantageous and at the end beneficial for the country. Similarly for Vietnam, and this is where I just want to focus on this particular instance for Vietnam, in which, for lots of reasons, the country, and understandable reasons, the country wants to focus on keeping a considerable amount of land in rice production. Well, that comes with an opportunity cost. And that opportunity cost comes directly from what happens to the global markets. Essentially, the type of rice and the quality of rice that Vietnam is exporting is not of high quality, and therefore they would lose a lot of in exports. So we're capable of looking at what happens to changes in carbon stock, what happens to emissions, and also what happens to the economy. And we're trying to refine this analysis and sort of come up with actual analysis of profits rather than just revenues. So what are the lessons learned? And I'm going to finish. So first of all, it was very clear that particularly in countries that have a considerable amount of forest, you have to consider all land uses in your analysis. Otherwise, you're going to miss a very big part of the story. Actually, the best opportunities of increasing resilience and increasing sort of an opportunity of reducing carbon stock come from an analysis and working at what we call the landscape level. And what we think have developed and what we think that we have learned now is that we know that decision makers do have decision support tools that can provide insights. They're not perfect, but they provide insights on what happens with adoption of certain policies and certain targets. And finally, and this is mostly driven by our experience in Colombia, where we're a strong collaboration with the Ministry of the Environment. And the strong collaboration comes from the fact that the modeling tool that we have put together is open to new data, so it's continuously, you can revise it, you can include new data when it comes available. It's fully transparent, which absolutely needed to gain their trust, and it needs to be adaptable to all the country situations. And finally, all the modeling skills need to be transferable, because all these analyses have to be revisited recursively, and they have to be revisited by the country itself. And all this work would not be possible without the help of a great team of people. And as usual, there's one person here speaking, but there's all a person behind the work. Thank you.